Welcome back to the Four Gardens podcast. I'm Jake Ifshin. The Four Gardens is an approach to cultivate a life of balance, joy, and abundance by focusing on four key areas. On this show, I talk to people inspiring me in those four gardens of health, nature connection, creativity, and service. To learn more, go to fourgardenspodcast.com and follow at Four Gardens Podcast on Instagram. Make sure to like and subscribe to hear new episodes and support this project. My guest today is Lexi Mondot. Lexi helps healers, coaches, instructors, and spiritual leaders of the New Earth movement decolonize oppressive systems from their practice using cyclical arts. I'm excited for my conversation with Lexi. Let's jump right in. Lexi, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. It's so great to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited. This is my favorite thing in the world to talk about. So I just am so honored that you reached out, and I can't wait to dive in. Yeah.
Yeah, I was really drawn to talking to you by your social media posts, your really strong message you're sharing around decolonization, around healing, around really empowering people to live a different kind of life, a life that, embracing really who they are, their real truth. And yeah, I like soak that up, and it just really made me want to talk to you.
Yeah. It's like the work of this era, right? And this paradigm shift that's happening that I know that so many people can feel happening. And it's, for me, it's just like the missing element, I think, in so many spiritual practices that we have and so many healing practices. We have this huge missing element of menstruality, right? Of cyclical arts that is just completely lost by the hyper masculinization and the colonization of our world, of that we just miss out on these cyclical elements.
Yeah, let's focus in on this key word of cycles coming up in a lot of what you're sharing and in your work, the cyclical arts. And I'm really drawn to this too, thinking about the garden as a metaphor for how we grow and thinking about ourselves as having seasons and having times. So I'd love to hear more about how cyclical arts and cycles flow for you.
Yes. So I'm so glad you asked, because cyclical arts is my spirituality. It's how I structure my life, because we have been pulled into, particularly womb holding bodies that have a really strong infradian rhythm. We have been pulled into this hyper masculine linear model, which all my philosophy is essentially that all humans are a balance of a masculine and feminine energy, right? And so we have this balance of circadian solar energy and infradian lunar energy. And it's all living things, right? All the plants, animals, humans, we all have both of these cycles, like moving in our bodies and on the earth. And so a lot of us are really familiar with like the circadian rhythms, right? A lot of us are familiar with like the 4 seasons. We know that in the wintertime, when it's cold out, you want to wear a jacket. And in the summertime, you probably don't want to wear like, your heavy jacket and scarves, because that would just be out of season for you. But the problem is that we are doing this all the time in our internal lives. In like when it comes to our infradian rhythms, we're doing this all the time. We are living out of tune because we are completely unaware, and we're like never even taught this stuff. It's just, it blows my mind, especially womb holders are never actually taught one of the most important cycles in their lives, which is the menstrual cycle. We're just like completely blind and clueless. Like we get out of, we're just told, like you bleed for one part of the month and then and that's it. But there's 4 seasons that are like, our brain chemistry changes a whopping 25% throughout the month. We become 4 different people, and ancients used to have archetypes to identify with those 4 different people that we become throughout the month. So there's the 4 seasons, like menstrually, right? and infradian rhythm, which non-womb holders also experience with the lunar cycle. And so we have that, the menstrual cycle, the lunar cycle, and then we have the solar cycle, which, like I said at the beginning, a lot of us are a lot more familiar with those 4 seasons. So every single month, if I gave like a quick rundown, what's actually happening in the body, mind, and spirit, like energetically, womb holders are going through their inner winter, which starts with menstruation. So if they are, most of us don't even track, a lot of people don't even know where they're at. And it starts with an inner winter, which is the menstrual phase, where it's a time, like in ancient times, where womb holders used to go literally to red tents away from society. And it's a time where we're not supposed to be working, where doing anything harsh on the body. Like, it's really a time for us to be hibernating, going inward. It's a time when our visions are heightened, where the left and right hemispheres of the brain are literally more connected. If you were to put it under a neurological, like, what is it called, MRI scan, right, you would actually see the brain more connected. So the feminine, masculine sides of the brain, the logic and creative sides, and the visions. And that's a time where we're really meant to be protected and away from other people, because this is when the visions are happening, right? This is when, like, the visionaries are most connected to source energy and most connected to our womb energy, which is like a big connection to the spirit world, to the internal power. And it's also our connection to our sacral chakra, right? This energetic center is like, it's shedding everything. It's shedding its blood, which the blood itself is also magical. And which is why we call it the Holy Grail, right? And so in the inner winter phase, I won't go into the 5 chambers, but there are actually 5 chambers of experience that if a womb holder is able to be fully resting, fully away from society, fully inward, they go through these 5 different chambers of experience, which leads to enlightenment at the end of every cycle. And so what's actually happening is we are shedding and birthing, right? So actually birthing something so that we can start a cycle again, kind of like on the earth, how the earth rests during winter. And everybody goes inside and they're warm, and you're doing your writing and you're thinking about the year, you're setting your New Year's resolutions because it's winter time and it's quiet, it's time to reflect. That is what womb holders are experiencing every single month, but it's a lot of times it's taken away from them because we have this myth that there's this saying that has gotten a lot of popularity, which I kind of like. It's called, anything you can do, I can do bleeding. And while, like, I love that premise and that idea, because it's true, we can, and we kind of had to, and our mothers and grandmothers had to, push themselves and work themselves during these phases to, and almost like erase their menstrual cycle altogether in order to succeed in a quote unquote man's world, in order to get their foot in the door. But our generation, like, we don't have to. Now that we are at this place where we're established, I want to rebirth this new connection where it's like, in our inner winter, even though we can do all of these things, it's actually hurting our bodies, minds, and spirits. And it's not allowing us to access the maximum capacity of creativity that we have within us and the maximum power that we have within us. And that's just our inner winter, right? So that is time for our visions, setting our intentions. And then we move through, I don't know if you want me to keep going through the seasons, but that is where we plant the visions, and we move into our actually follicular phase, which I refer to as an inner spring, where
Lexi, before you,
yeah,
I'm fascinated by this. I want to go. Yeah, no, I know there's so much here, and I'm fascinated by this because I'm just, I want to keep going on that journey of learning about this, and I'm noticing how there's just so much in what you're saying that's like already striking me. So I'm like waking me up to, like, I just want to name that. I know observing the reverence and curiosity that you're bringing to this menstruation cycle is not something that I feel like is in my field enough, is in our field culturally, of like how
Mhm.
just questions we're asking. So you're bringing this, and you're also, I just want to reflect back the deconditioning you're doing around, you're talking about around uh, how oppressive systems, I guess we could call them colonialist systems too, or capitalist
Mhm.
systems, have reframed the way we relate to to womb holders, to menstruation, in order to
Mhm.
maximize, I guess, productivity, to maximize some cultural standards. So I want to just capture those 2
Yeah.
points. And the last piece is just also what is coming up for me too, and we can revisit later in the conversation, is just how male body people and non-womb holders can support and learn from people who have wombs and are going through menstruation. Like, and that's where I just
Mhm.
want to embody that in this conversation, that I'm learning these cycles from you. And I'm like, oh, this actually, there's so much to learn here. If I listen, if I support, how do I exist in relation to people with wombs that are going through this spiritual journey, this spiritual cycle that's like full of so much
Yeah.
richness and growth and fertility in it.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that resonates so, so much. And yeah, so because there really is a spiritual journey, and every single month, and this is what I really emphasize is, we go through, so I talked a little bit about inner winter, but then we go through an inner spring, or like an inner maiden, we're waking up, and that's like a time when we can start to set the intentions from the visions that we've had. And then we get to our ovulatory phase, which is our inner summer. We're really like taking action, right? Really taking action on everything. But then what happens is, um, like in our inner summer, when we're like at our maximum capacity, we feel great, we feel aligned, like literally our pain tolerance increases. Um, our ability, our energy goes up, our estrogen is mounting, our ability to like deal with bullshit is at like an ultimate capacity, because that's the time when we're like supposed to be mating, right? That's the time when anything that would normally piss us off flies just fine, because it would, if not, it would interfere with our capacity to see somebody as worthy of mating with, right? So like this is why sometimes we say don't choose your mate while you're ovulating necessarily, because you want to have that clear eye. And then what happens is right after that, you go into your inner autumn, and just like the earth, everything dies. So we actually are experiencing a literal death within us if the egg is not fertilized. Like, and I think a lot of womb holders don't come to terms with this, where like we've written off PMS as this like bad thing, but there's two things happening. One, something is actually dying within us. Two, all of the, actually I'm going to say three things are happening. Two, all of that like that BS like mask that we could put on during our ovulatory inner summer phase comes down, and we move into what I call the truth serum phase. Because the body, like at this time, normally in your inner autumn, would be preparing for potential pregnancy. And so it's actually completely normal for us to be hypersensitive. All like our hypersensitivity to any type of pain goes up. Anything that we hear, see, taste, smell, our senses actually increase, because we are supposed to be hyper vigilant in case of any danger that might be happening, in case we might be pregnant, right? And so we're hyper vigilant on all of a sudden those things that flew, like when we were ovulating in our inner summer, like those socks on the floor, that's just not going to fly. We will see everything. Everything becomes a threat, and we are hyper vigilant. And it's actually an amazing time, right? It's amazing because in our inner autumn, while society writes off as like, oh, it's like PMS, we step into our wild woman archetype, our power, our ability to see the things that are not working in society, in our lives, in ourselves, and see what we do want. It is a truth serum, beautiful phase that then at the end, we experience what I call the void, which is right before you start bleeding again, where we literally fall into almost like nothingness and experience this death of the ego. And this is where the spirituality part comes in, right? This spiritual rebirth every single month, because every single month we're experiencing a death of the ego at the end of our inner autumn season. Just like in the wheel of the year, when we experience Halloween, right? You experience where the veil is thinning between the two worlds. And then you move into, you fully, right before you fully move into winter, like it's this very still phase, and it's like a grieving period, right? Like you really feel like we are grieving. And so when we think of this in the life cycle of a human, menarche is the beginning. It's when a young womb holder first experiences their menstrual cycle, right? And it's a time to be celebrated. Like non-womb holders, a lot of times they'll send them off on vision quests, but for womb holders, it happens spontaneously, right? That's why it's really important for womb holders around the menarche to really pay attention to their dreams and what's going on, because their vision of their purpose in life will be illuminated to them at their menarche. And then we spend from the menarche, we go into the mother phase, which is the I think it's like 435 something cycles that we'll have throughout our lifetime. And each of those is a small ego death that we are experiencing as we further and more closely approach our purpose in life. And it becomes more and more clear as we become more and more awakened until we reach what we call menopause, which would be the heightened the ultimate wise woman, right? This is somebody, or the wise womb holder, the person who has cycled, these 435 times and had all of these ego deaths to be fully enlightened. It's almost like the womb holding version of trying to reach enlightenment.
Yeah.
And so if we know this and we use our cycles in this way and are maximizing spiritually and energetically every single cycle, we can really access like the deepest, most nourishing parts of ourselves and our lives, and a wisdom that is so valuable to humanity, so valuable, that has been taken away because we don't have access to this information. We have birth control really shoved down our throats, and 80% of people on birth control are not even on it for contraception, and they are giving it to us for things other than actual contraception, but to quote unquote heal a lot of issues that actually come from us neglecting our cyclical nature. They're like, oh, well, you have acne or you're experiencing painful periods. A lot of times we're experiencing all this pain because we're trying to force ourselves into this like linear world and trying to force ourselves to work through our inner winter and not honoring all of these cycles, and have been fed the lie that we're not supposed to rest at any point in our cycle, when we have a built-in resting system, a built-in mechanism in our body for healing trauma, for healing ourselves, for connecting with our spiritual selves. And it's like what some people call the fifth vital sign. It's a vital sign to our health and our life. So if something is wrong, causing a lot of disturbances in our lives in our menstrual cycle, that is a big red flag that something in our lives, in our body, mind, or spirit, needs to be healed and dealt with. And the menstrual cycle can get us there. That cycle can get us there.
Yes.
But we end up numbing it, and we end up like using pills to almost eradicate the menstrual cycle from our lives, when it's one of the most powerful things about us as humans, as like human nature and humanity. And so it has been robbed, not just, like I said, from womb holders, but all of humanity. And it's something that will really help us to reconnect to ourselves, the gardens within ourselves, the earth within ourselves, as above, so below. Everything that is happening on the earth is happening within us in this menstrual cycle. And if we can heal that, we can heal global warming.
Beautiful. Yes. Oh man, that really, I'm fired up. And I feel like there's two sides of this too. I'm tuning in. Like there's that's raw. There's the side of this. The first part of this was just like, I didn't know about the seasons within the cycle, the seasons within women, and womb holders and menstruation.
Mm-hmm.
That I didn't know about all this wisdom and nuance that's into this. And like each of those, I'm hearing how each of those phases has its own wisdom and its own power to it and its own natural need that it meets. Right. So it's really
like the seasons
so much
on the earth.
Yeah, I think the seasons on the earth. And on the other side of this, of where you're ending with what you're saying, is how there's a lot of why and how have we suppressed this. That's the other side of the conversation. And like the healing piece of like first understanding the reasons and the methods like birth control that are have been imposed on womb holders, and then also that journey of healing. So I think that's a beautiful map of questions that I now have for you too. But I want to Talk about the richness of the cycles, right? And all this wisdom that you're harvesting from about the cycles, learning about the cycles, how this, like you gave examples as you went of how different seasons have different messages for womb holders
Mhm.
and for the people and societies around them too. And so, want to zoom back a little bit of how you're taking some of these. I know, and like a little bit of your business too, in your coaching practice around
Mhm.
how you're taking. Even examples would be great of how you're taking from these seasons and bringing this awareness to womb holders, to others who are interested, who are ready for this practice. Like, how does that? How do you offer that as a guidance surface?
Mm. Yeah. So, in two very distinct ways. So I do one-on-one coaching and I also do group coaching. And on the one-on-one coaching, it's really about using cyclical living to access the most powerful parts of yourself, right? And I do it for non-womb holders too. And it's really so cyclical living, like I said at the beginning, like I focus on 3 phases. So solar phases, um, lunar phases, and menstrual phases, right? So all 3 of those cycles, how we can learn to tap into your power and stop paddling upstream, because most of us are constantly working against our bodies, working against the lunar energies that are happening, working against the seasons. Like we have artificial light and we have artificial heat and all of these things that are trying to get us to force ourselves to be more productive, as opposed to just like living in flow with it. In wintertime, like, I have a lot of people that will struggle, for example, with seasonal depression, and like they're trying to do their business or step into their power, and they're like, well, it's like, well, part of it is doing, I do a lot of thought work and mind management work. What are the patriarchal structures in our mind and in our thought process that have created limiting beliefs that made you believe that you had to be productive during winter? How can we deconstruct that? How can we deconstruct your business so that you don't feel that you need to be on call all the time, and that you have it structured so that you are taking off every time you are bleeding, every time you're in your inner winter? And I actually have that built into my contracts with my clients, that like when I'm coaching you during my bleed, I am out of reach. During my bleed, I take those days off because I'm like we are with agricultural fields. I'm Pharaoh. Is that the word for it?
Yeah, fallow.
Pharaoh?
Yeah,
Fallow. I'm
fallow.
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 So
Yeah.
I'm resting during that time. And so I mean, from a practical like standpoint, because I'm talking mostly about energetics right now, but like practically, I give my clients embodiment practices to use. So I'm also a certified yoga instructor. So when I'm working with a client, I give them practices to do during their inner summer that will really help them to like maximize that fire energy that they'll have, because also a lot of anger can come up during that phase. So I might give them anger exercises, and energy release. And then for the inner winter, I'll give them, a certain like yin yoga and all the contraindications of things that they should not be doing in their inner winter to really help them energetically. And then I'll give them in their inner spring, that's a good time for them to detox. So I'll give them things like taking contrast showers, doing twists in your yoga practice, and a time to really be maximizing that fire using pranayama and all different types of breathing practices, because a lot of womb holders in their inner spring have a mounting of estrogen, and if they're not properly metabolizing it, and if they're not properly um, metabolizing the stress hormones in their blood, then they can override the liver and actually have excess estrogen, which can lead to like things like PCOS and a lot of other, and endometriosis and a lot of other fertility issues and fertile health problems. So it's like a lot of times we're given pills of how to deal with this, and I give people embodiment practices that really help them physically live in tune with the phases of their bodies, and that when we are, and we're just like learning how to flow with the stream of life, as opposed to like white knuckling through and trying to force ourselves into into being productive at like all times. how can we deconstruct, how can we decolonize our minds, number one? Like, what are the, and I use a lot of thought work around how we get rid of a lot of these limiting beliefs and how we actually work through building the habits, because a lot of us have trauma. That's the other big factor, is I do a lot of trauma work with my clients, because a lot of our adherence to these limiting beliefs that keep us stuck, like paddling upstream and trying to stay in this hyper productive mode and not honoring our bodies, is because we have a long history of trauma that we have inherited generationally, that we often don't talk about. So a lot of embodiment practices, somatic practices, hypnosis, and those types of things to deal with the trauma that might be standing in the way with our ability to live in tune with our cycles, live in tune with the cycles of the moon, the cycles of the seasons, and the internal cycles. And then on from a group standpoint, I'm actually rolling out a program, and it's opening on Monday. And this is a group coaching program where where I'm actually coaching coaches, healers, spiritual leaders, to actually implement and to be able to get certified in the menstrual magic method, where they can learn the in-depth nature of the 4 internal seasons. They can learn the history of this trauma, which goes way back to witch burnings and things, which I could talk about that too for an hour if I wanted. And teaches them all of the different layers that go with it. Because when we talk about decolonizing the womb as a society, and making our spaces inclusive and reducing harm, right? So if you're a yoga teacher and if you're not familiar with these menstrual cycles, you might be further harming your womb holding students. There's a lot of other layers to that, which goes with this colonization of the womb, which includes the white supremacist practices and systems that are in place, homophobic systems that are in place, ableist systems that are in place. There's all these other layers that really keep us, that keep a lot of our spiritual practices actually dangerous for marginalized groups. And so my goal really is to make sure that instructors are coming, that they're feeling confident that they are not further harming their clients and students, that they're coming in with an awareness that is cyclically aware of all of the seasons, of all of the trauma awareness that might be needed, of all of these oppressive systems at play and how we are feeding into them, and all the work that we need to do, and all of the mind work and thought work that we need to do, and the responsibility we have as leaders to make sure we're doing that work on ourselves, so that we're showing up for our clients in an ethical way and making these safe spaces for them. So
yeah. Oh, so many gifts you're giving to leaders, to individuals. Wow. It's just like, as I'm listening to you, I'm reflecting on too, how am I doing that work myself too? Curious about, I know you've gone through a long journey of this, but even just little things, noticing my season, like you don't need to be a womb holder. You said that to me too, like to
correct.
learn this
All
wisdom of
beings.
cycles. And
Mm-hmm.
we're all beings. We are nature, right? So nature has cycles. That's so it's simply
Yeah.
this fact of nature, this truth of nature, that living beings move in cycles, and even simple ways of how I'm being an awareness of my own energies and my own, when I'm ready to create and when I'm ready to be fallow, as we said before, ready to sleep and
Mm-hmm.
rest. And just like those simple ones, it starts there. But then I feel that now when you meet that with the world and we start talking about leadership and healing arts and coaching, things like that, of how you're helping leaders and others, like it gets more complicated, right? Because we're getting into, it starts with that simple awareness, but I notice how you're growing it into really something, a philosophy of how to really undertake the massive healing process that is presented to us as humans living in this time. So it's not just the simple, start simple, just like Four Gardens for me also start simple of let's just care for 4 areas of our life. But when you actually
Mm-hmm.
ask the question of how do we cultivate a balanced existence in this modern world, actually the work involved in that is pretty extensive. too. And so I think I'm
Yeah.
just grateful that there's guides like you that are taking that on in such a conscious way.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It gets so much more. Yeah, there's so many layers once you start to dig in. I mean, I love the Shrek analogy. I use that all the time with my clients because we really are like onions, and like once you start to peel off, I mean, it's just more and more layers underneath. And that's why cycles is so, I'm so passionate about it, because every cycle we're peeling off another layer and getting closer and closer to awakening. And that's really my vision, and my mission is to, it's I mean, like, of course, to help people, like that sounds great, but it's really to awaken people so that they can help themselves. It's really just to increase the awareness and to really awaken us to this truth that has been violently taken away from us. And how this deep connection, because I've done this with a lot of womb holders, and I've done a lot of workshops, and I have a lot of non-womb holders, and and people that are also who used to menstruate, who are no longer menstruating, and they are ravenous for this information. They jump in it and they want to know more, because like I said, I believe that all humans are a balance of this masculine and feminine energy. And some humans have more feminine energy than others, and some have more masculine energy than others. And this is part of what I deconstruct in my group program, is really understanding gender and sex from a decolonized point of view, is that we really all are human, right? And we all have these balances, and some have more than others, and it's not related necessarily to your sex. It's related to your personal energy and your energy center. So you might have a really strong infradian rhythm, and that it is in your right to know about this and learn about it and tap into that energy and be able to familiarize yourself with it. And so a lot of the practices that I give, you can definitely use. And what I do advise usually is to like start tracking how you feel with the lunar cycle as a good way to start, because the lunar cycle has these 4 seasons too, right? So the full moon would be your inner summer, and the new moon would be the inner winter type of energy. But you might find that your personal energy, your infradian rhythm, might be cycling a little bit differently than the moon. But it's a nice way to like start tracking that, right? If you start tracking how you're feeling with it, it's a really great way to get into those energies and honor it.
I love how this merges with both the cycles of the earth and the moon and the planets, and also how you're getting into some gender talk and work that I'm doing work on myself and learning about, and having my own
Mm-hmm.
sort of awakenings around some of the truth of what you're saying around how gender is related, not related to body, and we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about energies. And I think too that there's something really there. I noticed that's also part of your work too,
Mm-hmm.
gender, has been around. Would you talk about too how say a little more of how that's peeling back of the onion there, which is its own layer of
Mm.
colonialism and work and conditioning around gender, how that
Yes.
sort of works into your practice too of coaching and guiding.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, it's such an important layer of the onion. Yes. So, I mean, I'm personally gender queer, and my pronouns are she, they. And I've always just kind of like felt since I was born, that I didn't really identify as woman, and I didn't understand. And there's like a little bit of like body dysmorphia that comes with it. So I've always questioned gender, and I've always questioned why we do these things. Um, and have always questioned social things too. And I'm also neurodivergent, so there's another layer there too of just like not understanding social dynamics the way that I think neurotypical people do. And so I've always been super, super passionate about it. And I think one of the things that I try to, in order to like help people enter into understanding how important this is how how we have been sold this lie that there's this binary system, right? Because because I always hear people that are arguing for the binary system will often be like, well, it's science. And it's like, actually, in science, there's 16 different sex biomarkers in our bodies. And you can have a combination of male or female in any form of those 16 biomarkers, right? And there are as many people born intersex as there are people with red hair. Like, that's a pretty large amount of the population, right? But then we do all of these scientific studies, we call them scientific, dividing people in these two groups, which is not scientific because there's way more groups than that. And so there really is this like spectrum, right? And there's so many ancient cultures that used to have, 16 different genders that they would identify. I mean, most people are familiar with the Native American Two-Spirit, but there's so many more than that, right? And that is just sex. And then gender is how you actually identify socially in the world, right? And socially in the world, that is all constructed by humans. I mean, being able to deconstruct this for people, there's a lot of education, I think, that goes into it, because a lot of people just aren't aware, and a lot of people don't know what language to use. And so in the certification, that's part of a big part of what we go into is how can we deconstruct this myth that we are in these like two buckets that is hurting everybody, that was actually put into place in order to maintain power. Because the more you can divide people into groups, the more power you can maintain. And then when it comes to like the actual socialization of what we do, it's I think a lot of people don't realize that all of our beauty standards and a lot of our like practices around the body and the way that we treat the body and the things that we do to the body are ingrained in patriarchy and childhood brides, like even just practices of being hairless, of having a flat stomach, which is actually harmful because a lot of womb holders will tighten their stomach or suck it in or hold it really small when it's actually meant to be round and take up space. And that comes from, marrying off womb holders at age 12, of like where having this appearance of a flat stomach, which is just not for a powerful womb holding being. If you look at ancient sculptures, they had those big round stomachs, large breasts, like allowing that to be powerful and take up space. But if you want to take away power, you infantilize an entire half of the species, right? And if you say only womb holders can only be feminine and non-womb holders can only be masculine, and divide them into these two groups, which was very much heightened at the height of white supremacy, because they wanted to give off the idea that a society is more quote unquote civilized, the more different their quote men and women look from each other. That the more different they can look, the easier it is to differentiate between the two, the easier it is to control one of the subgroups. And there's all of these standards put into place that were actually really, really harmful to the Black community, on all of these standards that are saying, this is a certain way to look as a womb holder in order to make you look less uncivilized. And you can see ads even in like the 50s geared towards white women to try to make them look less hairy, less round, all of these things. And you'll even see like that was the rise of circuses of quote unquote freak shows of women with beards or mustaches, which a lot of womb holders do have facial hair. A lot of womb holders do have these things. And so it's just like, it's just so interesting to me, the amount of shame that has been poured into us to keep us focusing so much of our energy, time, and money into fitting into this binary structure. And it's like when I stopped shaving, I get so much time in my week. Like that's like an hour a day that I get back in my life. And that is power that is time and power that we're taking away from womb holders who could be better spending their energy towards cultivating something and making a better world, instead of trying to, like, if it were so natural for us to look this way, how are we spending like billions of dollars and billions of hours trying to fit into this mold when we could be using all of that time and energy towards making a world that is equitable?
So this is such important information you're sharing, and your take on it. It's like really inspiring me and moving me right now. And I want to also name one of the stakes of this conversation is violence. Is how has this system been perpetuated? How does it look in its like darkest? Both the system, how it's been upheld, and how it's currently still working is violence against trans people. People are murdered at incredibly high rates, much higher than anybody other groups. Against the still widespread violence against women and against people who don't fit into these gender norms. So not only is it just an efficient way to direct our energy, a better way to direct our energy than wasting so much time and hurting people by keeping this up, but there is this, like, there's so much, you said, so much power there. And it's also though just this piece of, I want less violence. I want less people to be killed for being themselves and how they exploring their real identity for being who they are and for not having to it's freedom. You know, you said that one of your latest posts, this is a year of freedom, I think, of 2022. And you were talking about that. And I love that. I think that's what's at stake too. On one end, it's violence and oppression. On the other end, we're talking about freedom. And yes, it's some of that violence, we can talk about where that comes from. And there's real roots of this. You talked about power and control. I also think about that being a big root of it. And I think about greed and other kinds of separation myths that are causing this. But yeah, I just wanted to point out that stake of violence that's at stake, and that finds its way not just in physical violence against people too, but also thinking about, going back to what you said about chemicals that we're told to put in our body, of birth control, what in the garden metaphor I think of as pesticides that we're spraying on ourselves to meet a monoculture system that wants to harvest from
Oh my gosh, I just got chills when you said that. It is like pesticides that we're like putting into ourselves. Yeah.
We'll talk about that for a second, then go back to chemicals and the unnatural versus the natural and how you're working with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's so interesting because that you say that. It's so interesting. Oh my gosh, this is like, I have like a light bulb that went off too, because the history of this violence started with the rise of agriculture.
That's right.
Which is just blows my mind now that we're like thinking about it in this way and we're talking about it. Because if we go back to like matrilineal and equitable societies that we just write off as quote unquote not civilized, right? Like when you Google like humans, they're like, oh, civilization as we know it is only 6,000 years old. That's because we are writing history as if patriarchy was the beginning of civilization. And there were all of these civilizations that existed long before patriarchy, which when you like, I think there was this archaeologist, like one of the first like womb holding archaeologists, who went back and was like, hey, like I'm going to re-look at all this information because it's always done with this patriarchal white supremacist lens. So I want to relook at old Europe and what was going on. And what she found was that there were all of these goddess praising cultures. I mean, humans have been around for 200,000 years, right? And when we learn about history, we only learn about like quote unquote civilizations of like the past 6,500 years, where there were patriarchal power systems in place. And in the eugenics movement, they'll see archaeologists that actually have written in their documents that in order for a society to be studied and considered a civilization, they must be patrilineal. They must be patriarchal. But before that, you know, you have systems and societies that are matrilineal, that are polyamorous, that, you know, the whole tribe takes care of the children, that it is matrilineal, that there is an equitable system that is way different than anything we could even imagine today, because we have been so indoctrinated with this system, this new patriarchal white supremacist ableist system that's like, this is quote unquote reality, when it's only been reality for a very short time of humanity. And we had these we had these equitable societies in old Europe. And what actually happened during the rise of agriculture was the emphasis on the importance of the sun god, of sun, which is associated with the masculine energy, started to rise over time, right? And so what my theory is that it's like, you know, you have these societies that are very balanced with lunar energies, solar energies, and their own menstrual energies, and everything, and all these cycles. And then when agriculture starts to become more prominent in societies, and they start to see it as more valuable, and they start to see solar energy as the more quote unquote valuable energy than the lunar energy, then you start to get this imbalance, right? You have this imbalance where all of a sudden the sun gods, the masculine gods, start to take power or start to take precedence, and you actually have like sun cults that took over in old Europe and actually violently took over a lot of the old Europe and the Celts, which Celts actually spread across all of old Europe previously. And all the way as it gets like, as they gain more and more power, and you lead to places like Rome, where it's like the ultimate patriarchy, right? What was like founded on raping all of the women in that town and taking them as essentially slaves, as taking them as wife slaves, and actually increasing levels of infanticide, where they're actually killing off girl babies so that men would outnumber women and have the power, and we're keeping them at a young age and marrying them off at age 12, so that you're almost removing an entire side of an entire half of humanity's wisdom, right? And so, but they saw it as, you know, this value system, this new value system that they started to put in place that we now know as the patriarchy, which is just assumed that it's like it's always been like that, but it hasn't. It was, and it came with the rise of agriculture and that hyper production of us being able to control nature, right? Of us having our tools, you being able to use our tools and our structure and our masculine energy. It just kind of went in the hyper mode. So I think we might have had like the hyper feminine mode, and then we have this 6,500 years of this hyper masculine mode. And now we're in this new paradigm, right? That's birthing right now, where I feel like we're coming into like this genderless paradigm, where we're like, okay, can we find a way to be a lot more equal in our solar and lunar energies as humanity, and really honor both of them equally? Because this violence that we need to heal from, like it runs so deep, and we just don't talk about it. We don't talk about it. Like when we and this is why I love, you know, identifying as a witch and talking about witchcraft, because we don't actually talk about the truth of how much harm has been caused to humanity by the witch burnings. If you Google witch burnings right now, or like witch trials, every single time Google will bring you to like, oh, Salem witch trials, when, you know, maybe about 16 people were killed, and you know, oh, because people back then were so dumb that they actually thought witchcraft existed. And it's like, no, witchcraft very much did exist. Like it wasn't like magic wasn't just this fake thing. It was their spirituality. They were nature-based spirituality. And during the witch scares, like in old Europe, like it wasn't just like 16 people in Salem. No. In old Europe, they were like, the numbers are very conflicting, but it's like 9 to 12 million people that were murdered, killed, buried alive, burned at the stake, daughters going against mothers, mothers against daughters. Nowhere was safe. There were entire towns where sometimes only one woman was left in the entire town because they had killed all the rest of them. And it was all to control the spirituality. And this, like, I don't know if I want to get all into Jesus and Mary Magdalene. I don't know if I'll go there, but like there was a lot of spiritual power in womb holders because they're so connected to source directly through their womb. Like when you're literally pulling in souls from, you know, the other side of, you know, from the other side through your womb, you have that deep connection to source energy, and there's so much power and wisdom that comes with that. And so if you're going to take over and control the world spiritually and colonize the world using religion, you're going to have to kill and violently get rid of any of those womb holders that are connected to herbalism, are connected, our midwives, our doulas, all of them, they had to go, right? In order for the system to be able to colonize the world, they had to get rid of them. And we don't talk about this trauma. Like, we never talk about this in history. We talk a lot about other genocides and things that have happened, but we don't talk about the like mass femicide that happened and how it was directed at womb holders, at women. And we're like, oh, well, men were also killed in the witch burnings. It was like, well, it was anybody that practiced that nature-based spirituality and anybody that was connected to these menstruality practices and had that wisdom. And I recently even learned like that had that wisdom of herbal practices, of of doula practices, midwifery, any of these things, menstrual practices, and menstruality as a spirituality. And I recently learned that like it wasn't even just the actual killing of them. But one example that I recently learned was that they had the German purity laws, which is why beer today is made mostly with hops, is because all of the household like womb holders, women, witches, um, each town in Germany, like there were a lot of womb holders and women that had their own herbal remedies for things, and they would make beers with all different types of herbs. And the German purity laws were in order to take away their power. They said you can only make beer with these 3 herbs, and all of a sudden you're taking away all the medicinal power of the womb holders who were still alive, who were escaped the witch burnings, taking away their power to do their herbal work. And it's just mind blowing to me that we are born with this womb trauma. A lot of people call it the mother wound, but all of this womb trauma and this innate fear that keeps us from really stepping into and rebirthing these practices again and stepping into our power as leaders, because we have this like collective trauma that has never been fully healed.
Wow. There's so much to talk about here. You really offered a beautiful and poignant map of human consciousness evolution, talking about agriculture into the period of witch burning, and the rise of the Industrial Revolution. These are like 2 key big macro consciousness evolution moments of shifting to patriarchal agricultural society, and then the second one of switching to industrial society. These are, I think, both worthy of a lot of examination by everyone listening to this. And one piece I wanted to add to the second part of this, the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment, is that not only were witches and women and all the natural religions targeted, but also the mainstream religions that we're familiar with now are also shaped during those times, where Gnostic Christianity, other types of Christianity, of Judaism. I read a book called Magic of the Ordinary, which talks about how 300 years ago, Judaism which is my background, was much more witchy, was much more earth-based, had 4 connections in it, was more of a matrilineal culture than it is now. It became very patriarchal in how it's applied now and how it's lived. And that happened around the same time the witches were being burned, that Jews were also invited to purge the feminine and purge the spiritual from their tradition, which is like a birthright I've lost of not being connected to the magic of that Judaism used to hold, and the spiritual component was restricted. And so many other examples of this. It was the Roma too, and like we just think of the genocide moments, but that was also a massive cultural shift of not having those the witches in the society, not having the herbalists. Like you talk to people now. We would lead workshops in our nature business of having people. One of them was around, what are you inheriting in terms of natural remedies and herbalism? Like what are your family, what's passed down to you? And it's so limited now what we get, what people were writing. I got from my family of what plants I know how to use, what my connection is to magic, or to not even just magic, of just pure simple. There's free medicine right out there. If you know 10 plants, you can go and heal like injuries and wounds without spending any money. And like it's wild. It's taken from us. So you named so many things. And I just also, one last piece of this is that I also want to come back to how you're guiding people here as we come to close, that the book by Frederick Laloux, Reinventing Organizations, he looks at where organizations. gives his own, I think you would probably want to make your own version of this, but he makes a version of where are organizations on the evolution of human consciousness, of where is your organization, like which part of this trajectory is it on? Is it one of these hyper masculine, militant kind of organizations is early on, or like one of the second ones? Is it tribal? Is it, and eventually where his progression takes us is to an organic system that can heal itself, where every member of an organization can be aware of the greater natural whole and be improving its health and its vitality. And so I just think about that as you talk about guiding humans and organizations, of helping humans identify where are they on this evolutionary trajectory, and where are we. And like the way what you really helped me with, why this came up for me, is you're talking about really getting the wisdom of cycles is getting back to the highest wisdom of nature. It's really
yes. Oh, I want to quote you on that. Yes.
Yeah,
it really is.
I know we're kind of coming to an end of our time, but I want to give you a little chance to respond to that and just kind of offer some last thoughts for our listeners around, you've shared so much beautiful wisdom today. I'm so thankful for you. I want to give you a little more space here at the end.
Oh, thank you. Oh, I'm so thankful to come on and be able to share and speak. And this is just, again, it's the fire within me. I've just feel so driven to share it, because like it's changed my life in ways I could never have imagined. And it's really opened me up to living the most authentic, full, powerful, nourishing life that I never thought possible back when I was really allowed myself to be a victim to all of these systems, right? Like I was in a really, really bad place. And like with all of the trauma that came from it, that it was not properly like metabolized and dealt with in my life, and I didn't know, and I didn't have the tools. So I think something to just kind of like close out is, it's like for those of you that like are, feel like you're really, really struggling, just like know that like everything you've been taught is bullshit. And like everything you've been taught is bullshit in order to keep you disconnected from nature and from yourself and from the truth that you have the power within you to heal yourself. We have the power on our earth to use the herbs to heal ourselves. We have the power to connect and be our own spiritual authority, to be our own wellness authority, and then to be able to spread that and help awaken people by really connecting with inner truth and with what is natural, which is right around us. If we are willing to break down the walls of what we've been taught, we can see it in nature. We can see it happening in the seasons. We can see it happening in the lunar cycles. We can see it in the tides. We can feel it in our bodies, and to just know that our bodies don't lie. So if there is something happening in your menstrual cycle, listen to it, because your body has all of the wisdom that it needs in order for us to heal. Like movement does not lie. That's a quote from Martha Graham, one of my favorite dance philosophers. Is that the right word? And is that movement really doesn't lie if we are willing to listen to it, if we're willing to break down all of the limiting beliefs that were put there by patriarchy, by white supremacy, by ableism, by homophobia, by transphobia, all of these things. If we can really take an honest look at them and an honest look at ourselves and do the painful shadow work of like what we've been taught to peel those layers away, we can reduce the harm to our own selves, like the internalized things that we are doing to oppress our own selves and keep ourselves disconnected from our inner nature and our inner cycles and the external nature and external cycles. That if we can really allow ourselves to be open to that and to have the courage, and this is where I'll leave it, is it's really about courage, because it's about feeling the fear of all the reality of how we've known it crumbling before us and doing it anyways, is being able to be that connected and that committed to your own evolution, your own growth, to humans' evolution and growth and love. And so much so that we no longer allow the fear of violence and the fear of death and the fear of poverty and illness and these things that have been held above us as a way to manipulate us out of connecting to these cycles. If we can overcome those fears collectively and use, mind management work to do that, we will become a force of nature not to be reckoned with.
Yes. Lexi, just grateful for your time today, your energy, your heat you bring to this, for coming on today. I feel catalyzed. I feel awakened just by this conversation. It's bringing me, reminding me of just a fascinating, but also super challenging and amazing work ahead of us we have to do. And I just found this conversation really brought me, I harvested a lot of inspiration from it, of truth, of learning. Like you just, just really grateful for you taking the time today and really, celebrate you. Thank you so much.
So grateful to be here and so grateful to talk with you. Thank you for creating this platform. It's super important. And the work that you're doing, it's super important. So thank you for putting all of that time and energy into bringing these conversations to light.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for listening to my conversation with Lexi Mondot. Feeling very inspired by them, as I mentioned, and really encourage you to check out their Instagram at the Yoga Witches, and we'll share links below in the description. Definitely connect. I'd love to hear what you think about this powerful episode. How did this meet you? Some of these conversations we had about cycles and gender and menstruation. These are topics that I feel like have a lot of energy in them and a lot of power in the collective consciousness now. So please drop us a line, leave a comment on any of the videos, or send us an email at fourgardenspodcast@gmail.com. Just really grateful for you taking the time today. Keep on growing.